Hey, this is Good Faith Dialogue. Hope you're doing well. This is the third content-related video on this channel following the channel introduction, and it concerns a proof for the existence of God and then the implications of that for the nature of God. And so a disclaimer, I recognize that if this proof is true, I would say that no, it is, but on the supposition that it is true, it doesn't prove Christianity in particular or Islam in particular or any particular monotheistic religion specifically, and it doesn't address the problem of evil in particular. I hope to do a video on that in the future. And so here's the proof. So it begins with kind of a big first paragraph, but the goal is to shape an intuition using kind of different ways of wording the same central idea. So no individual thing in the universe around us in the here and now is self-existent. Each thing depends on something other than itself to continue to exist. None is self-explanatory. There's nothing about this or that thing or this or that thing's nature that guarantees that it will keep on existing, or even that it must necessarily exist in the present moment, in the here and now. For example, a tree. A tree isn't self-explanatory. It doesn't have its full reason of being in itself, because it clearly depends on the earth and the air and temperature and the sun in the present moment in order to be sustained. And if these things were moved, it would die. And so we can know from that that the explanation for its existence it points to something outside of itself. It's not self-explanatory. And so, two, by definition, the universe is just the sum total set of non-self-explanatory beings. And so that's just what I mean by the word. When I say universe, I'm just referring to things like those that are non-self-explanatory, like the things that make up the planets and all that. And so since every part of the set of the universe, since every part is non-self-explanatory, and since the whole universe is no more than the sum of its parts, by definition, it's just a set, the whole universe is non-self-explanatory. And so it depends on something other than itself. So the universe, the set of non-self-explanatory beings, and so this whole set's non-self-explanatory. So the universe must ultimately depend on something which is self-existent, is self-explanatory, and is not dependent on something else. And so this self-existent being that we're talking about is the cause of the universe in the here and now and sustains everything in existence. And so someone might reasonably ask, well, why can't you have, in the here and now, why can't you have an infinite number of things sustaining other things? That would seem to be kind of self-explanatory, because even though, if every part's not self-explanatory, maybe the whole could kind of be its own explanation. And I would say that the reason that can't be is because simply adding any number or even an infinite number of dependent beings together doesn't explain their existence. So it presupposes their existence, but it doesn't do the explanatory work that's necessary in light of the particular observation of this thing, and thus the whole is characterized by a non-self-explanatoriness through and through. And so it's kind of permeated and characterized by this non-self-existence, non-self-explanatoriness, and so it can't account for itself. And further, it's because none of these things has existence in a necessary built-in stable way that's guaranteed by its nature. They don't exist just because of what they are. So like the kudzu plant over there, it doesn't exist just because it's a kudzu plant. Like its nature doesn't guarantee that this particular will keep on existing, or even that any particular kudzu is brought in to existence at any present moment. And so if something doesn't just exist by nature in a built-in, stable, necessary way, its existence, if it does exist, its existence must be caused from without by something other than itself. And this is because a cause can't give what it doesn't have in itself in some fundamental way. And so I guess a more down-to-earth example, if I don't have any money, I can't give you any money in the here and now. And so if if you are receiving money from me, I have to actually have money, in me, on my person, of myself. And so if a thing isn't self-explanatory, it can't fully explain something else because it points to something else. And so if a thing can't explain itself, then it can't be the proper, sufficient explanation for anything else because it points to something else. It points to the explanation for its existence terminates in something other than itself. And so now to continue the proof, well, given that this being exists, what the nature of this being must be like. And so whatever is changing is dependent on the thing changing it. This is obvious. If something is being pushed by me, or if something is being pushed, it depends on the pusher. But this self-existent being we're talking about is not dependent on anything else. Otherwise, it would need an explanation and so on. So this being is unchangeable. So I'm negating changeability of it. Further, whatever is self-existent doesn't lack anything and is complete or perfect. It has all that it, has by nature. And it couldn't get anything from anything else. Otherwise, it would be dependent on something to complete or perfect it. And there's no dependency whatsoever to this being. So this being is perfect. And since time is the measure of change, before and after, this being is absolutely unchangeable, and so it is outside of time. Not to imply like physically, but it is not measurable by time. Like the category of before and after, with the movement of like physical parts or anything, doesn't really apply to this being. And this being existed always. Otherwise, it would need a cause to bring it into existence. And so obviously it would be dependent on that cause. So this being is eternal. And again, not like eternal in the sense of like infinite ticks of a clock, because just the category of before and after, like putting a stopwatch up to it or a clock wouldn't make sense, also in part because for the next premise. So matter is changeable, but this being is unchangeable. So this being is immaterial. And so, time involves kind of something physical moving to measure it. And so that which is not material is kind of outside the category of before and after and change. Also, a thing is, so to speak, wherever it is doing something or, influencing or causing something. And this being, necessarily, is in all places, sustaining things in existence. So this being is omnipresent. And this is because every being that is non-self-explanatory, if it exists or since it exists, it must be ultimately caused and dependent on the unchangeable, independent being. And so this being is in all places, not in the same way as like a physical thing is in all places, because a physical thing is bounded by its surface, and you can't have two, different chunks of matter in the same place. One excludes the other. But this being is present in all places in a way that allows and causes the existence of physical things. And so to continue, if something is limited in any way, it is dependent on something to limit it, either dependent on a part or dependent on something outside itself or something like that, dependent on a surface, something like that. But this being is not dependent in any way. There's no dependency to it. And so this being is infinite or unlimited in its nature. And further, this being clearly has causal power. And since this being is unlimited and infinite in nature, and again, those are negations, not limited and not finite in nature, it must have infinite causal power, and so is omnipotent. And so I guess connecting it back to a previous video about the immateriality or non-physicality, I'm just negating certain things. I'm not saying, or like trying to picture what this being is. I'm saying what, given what follows necessarily from, I would say, these true premises, that certain things must be, denied, including limitations and so forth from this being. And so then just zooming back out, a general causal principle, the general feature of causality, whatever is in an effect must exist somehow really in its cause. So like if I'm giving, if you're being given money, I have to have money to be able to give you in the here and now. So, but you and I have intelligence, the power to know, and then the actual ability to know that we're exercising. And we are effects of this being in the here and now. And so, since whatever is in effect must exist somehow in the cause, intelligence must exist in this cause. And so, this cause is intelligent, or in other words, knowing, capable of knowing and actually knowing. And since this being is infinite, not limited in any way, and unlimited in every way by nature, and intelligent by nature, it must be infinitely intelligent or omniscient. And if this being were compelled to create, it would be dependent on whatever compelled it to create, either some like necessary feature it had or on something outside. But this being created freely because there's no dependency whatsoever that's attributable to this being. And so this being has free will, again, negating compulsion or limitation or dependence on something. And since this being has mind and will, and since whatever has a mind and will, the thinker and a chooser, is a person and is personal in nature, so this cause is personal, as opposed to kind of a vague life force or something that had no mind or will. And so, therefore, there exists an unchangeable, perfect, eternal, immaterial, omnipresent, infinite, omnipotent, omniscient, and personal creator and sustainer of the universe in the here and now, and also whenever any dependent being exists. So that's any here and now, so for all time, including the past. Such a being would be rightly called God. And I guess a clarification before going to the next slide, this argument doesn't really concern whether the past was infinite or not. That's another kind of argument. This just begins with the observation that in the here and now, things depend on other things. And so the series or the number of things that depend on other things is not infinite. And so it can't be turtles all the way down, so to speak. And so another clarifying note, this being is immaterial or non-material, so it can't be pictured. And of course, we all, try to picture all this kind of stuff. But to say that it can't be pictured doesn't mean that we can't know that it exists or know anything about it, because there are a great many things in our daily experience that we encounter and reason about that are not visible or invisible, but nevertheless knowable with certainty. So like numbers, we do math all the time. You can't see, touch, taste a number, and yet we can have absolute and infallible certain knowledge of mathematical truth. And like in geometry, like I can't picture a 70 million sided figure, but I can know with absolute certainty that a 70 million sided figure has one more, or like, polygon, regular polygon. I can know that a 70 million plus one side has one more side than just a 70 million sided figure. And so even causality itself, whenever we use because, or when I say this happened because this, we know that causality is a real feature in the world and a real feature of human thought, and that they map onto each other. But causality as such is like the notion, the idea, the concept of it that maps on the world. It's not something that can be seen, touched, tasted, and yet we interact, so to speak, with it all the time. We reason concerning it because we use the word because a lot. Well, let's suppose there's more than one. Why can't there be more than one? And that's a reasonable objection. Well, to test it out, suppose there were two or more perfect, independent, self-existing beings. If so, there would have to be some distinguishing feature that one of them had, but that the other lacked, but conceivably could be conceived, or could be conceived to have, in order to distinguish them. So in other words, they're different. If they're different, they have to be different for some reason. There's something about them that makes them different. But if something lacks some particular completing feature that it conceivably could have, it is imperfect. And further, it would be dependent on whatever could give it that feature. And so since there's no dependence to this being, since we started out by supposing there were two perfect independent beings, there can't be more than one perfect independent being. And a common objection is, well, if everything has a cause, then what caused God? And so to respond, the claim isn't that everything has a cause. The claim is that whatever is non-self-explanatory, or whatever is caused, whatever has the reason for its being in something else, it must ultimately be caused by something capable of causing, namely something that has existence of itself in a kind of built-in, underived, unreceived way that it's able to give without being dependent on another. And so suppose you have like object A and object B, or whatever. If A is causing B's existence in the here and now, that means that B is dependent for its existence or being actual on A for its actual existence. And so I get I resonate with the notion that, well, it seems like it's contradictory because God's self-caused, but there's no contradiction in a non-dependent causer of dependent things. There's only a contradiction in a being that is both dependent and independent in the same respect. And so I think the reason this objection has so much rhetorical weight is because 99% of the things in our experience are causers. I mean, they're clearly dependent on other things, but they clearly cause other things. And so that reasonably leads us to think, well, existence is just bound up with being caused, but to exist doesn't mean the same thing as to be caused, because a thing can have existence in an uncaused, underived way. There's no contradiction in that. And so, again, I'm not saying that God is self-caused. That would be contradictory, because that would seem to imply that he would exist before himself to cause his own existence. And of course, that is contradictory. All I'm saying is that his existence is not dependent on another. I'm just negating the dependence of his existence on something other than himself. And so why does this matter? I think it matters because what makes us uniquely and characteristically, definitively human is the raw ability or capacity by nature to know truth and to live and love ourselves and others from the place of this understanding of reality. And so it's also a fact of experience that only something infinite, not finite, and personal in nature, as opposed to impersonal, can make us happy. So we're not satisfied with just this or that set of things. And even if we had all the things in the world, if we had no love, we would be miserable. And so I think this matters, and I put this out there because there is actually something in reality that corresponds to our deepest desires and longings and reasons for human striving and effort in any domain or any course of work and sphere of life. An infinitely loving and good personal God. Thank you for watching, and take care.